The Expedition series enjoys quite a bit of success nowadays. Back when Expeditions Conquistador came out, it definitely caught my attention, but I had a garbage laptop that couldn't run it to save its own life, so better later than ever, I guess. RPGs in historical settings are few and far between, and we all know what happened the last time I had my hands on something fitting this description. But don't be mistaken, this is a very different breed indeed. As you might imagine, you take the role of a conquistador who tries to find fame and fortune in the mysterious new world. Not just any conquistador though, but a stand-in for Hernan Cortés. And for good measure, you've been tasked by the Spanish crown to find the whereabouts of another expedition that went missing. Thus, you get to assemble your band of mercenaries and set sail for the island of Hispaniola as your first contact with the Americas. But once you arrive there, you get the unpleasant surprise of getting your stuff confiscated and forced by the island's governor to not leave until the current rebel uprising has been quashed. You're handed the reins from this point and the world is your oyster. Or something of the sort, at least. Conquistador has multiple gameplay layers, so I'll try to take them one at a time before diving in for details. Here goes nothing, I guess. Firstly, you have the map movement, which is limited by the number of movement points you've got at the start of the day. While riding around, you can also pick goodies such as building materials, money, healing herbs or meat from roaming animals. If you've ever played a Heroes of Might and Magic title in the past, this is a familiar territory. The twist is that at the end of the day you have to set up camp, distribute food and assign tasks for your subordinates, like guarding, hunting for more food or process your collected resources. The efficiency of these tasks depend on the skill levels of the people assigned to them. Beyond protecting your camp from ambushes, the camp mechanic allows for quite a bit of resource management. Obviously, your travels will lead you into conflict as well. The battles take place on self-contained map with up to 6 members of your band facing up against usually numerically superior opposition. The combat uses a system similar to the Firaxis XCOM games, but a bit more simplistic. For those wondering, you guessed it, missing 95% shots hurts my soul just as much. Last but not least, you have your followers and their abilities. Just like the combat, this aspect is pretty simplistic. Each character comes with traits that mainly influence morale and other things to a lesser extent. They also belong to a class, which affects the abilities they unlock when they are promoted by you. One class ability is automatically gained, but you get to choose a passive trait bonus on each level. Phew, that was quite the PowerPoint presentation if I do say so myself. Now that I got this out of the way, how's all of this working out in the end? Well, since I just mentioned it, the promotion mechanic is an interesting decision by the devs. Instead of each follower automatically leveling up if he does well, experience is a collective resource which you can spend to promote who you prefer. The reasoning is quite simple. Many of your band members will never set foot on the battlefield due to only being able to field 6 people at a time. In fact, with a few exceptions, you'll end up using the same group of followers every fight. So the risk of them hogging all of the XP was extremely high. You can add to the fact that each party member has skills relevant to the end of day camp mechanic, which can be upgraded after each promotion. So in the light of all of this, the dev's choice is inspired. Sure, I won't ever see most of my people in combat, but this way you have a genuine reason to keep them in your party and let them consume your rations at the end of each day. But not everything is fine and dandy, particularly regarding the system's execution. The class abilities that I mentioned are hit or miss concerning their usefulness or how interesting they are. Worst of all, they're set in stone for each class. It's not an ability tree, but a straight fixed line. The only source of flexibility comes from picking up passive traits and... where do I start with this? Well, the obvious thing is that this list is a clusterfuck of a mess to navigate. All of them are listed in alphabetical order, with no sorting feature or graphical elements that would make browsing easier on the eye. It's pretty sad because the rest of the UI better showcases critical information in an efficient manner. Moving away from the looks, the options list is dull and lackluster. Percentage bonuses upon percentage bonuses with nothing that brings significant change to the playstyle. Well, except the one that allows characters to get more healing in combat and thus is an auto pick for melee fighters. These issues are mirrored in the combat as expected. First, the experience is relatively dull due to the little flexibility when developing your characters. This wouldn't be terrible if it didn't come in the same package with the frankly lackluster UI. There's very little information at your disposal regarding your opponents. And by very little, I mean you can see only their health. Yes, that's it. You can't see their weapons, their abilities, armor, movement speed, nothing of the sort. I know Conquistador is mainly an RPG, but this absence of information is rather poor for turn-based combat. This doesn't end here either, because the camera also does a terrific job of frustrating you. You can't tilt it, and worst of all, there's no option to make props semi-transparent. It wasn't just once when I could not see an enemy because he was hidden or camouflaged. It's very frustrating since the game loves to punish your mistakes. And said mistakes are easier to make than you'd expect because the pathfinding really hates avoiding the opponent's zone of control. Thus, in many instances, you have to move your units one tile at a time to get them in the path you desire. Ranged combat is also hurt because it relies on lines of sight that don't always work as expected. The angle of the camera, coupled with the absence of a way to preview lines of sight, means you'll have plenty of moments when you think you can shoot an enemy only to be met with a dreaded red line. There's also no explanation for how accuracy is calculated or how distance influences it beyond closer means higher percentages. Like that would stop you from missing point blank. Fuck! Obstacles offer cover, but not always, and there's no way to know it beforehand since it's inconsistently applied. A rickety fence offers half cover just as much as a big rock in the middle of a field. It's so over the top that I learned to ignore the mechanic entirely and just go fast and loose with my positioning against ranged enemies. Oh, and good luck with figuring out if a hill blocks or allows a clear line of sight thanks to the terrible camera angle. It's a shame because behind all these complaints there is a relatively decent and challenging combat system. I know I seem very negative, but the reality is that the experience is okay, and I certainly don't hate it. The game doesn't pull punches either, and you're often put at a disadvantage before you can attempt to turn the tide. Sure, more difficult fights can only be won with incredibly cheesy strategies. But the problems I mentioned can make the experience quite frustrating. But it's not awful either. Imagine a leftover cold pizza from yesterday that has a lot of olives which you hate, but a delicious pepperoni that you really enjoy. That's Conquistador's combat system. Jesus Christ, these fucking analogies, oh my god. The map exploration is enriching to an extent. Alright, let's walk back a little before I get into this. Conquistador has two maps to explore. The first is the island of Hispaniola, which acts as a sort of elaborate tutorial. After completing that questline, you're free to roam through the Aztec lands in today's Mexico. They both offer plenty different experiences, but not all for the best. Hispaniola is relatively small and thus has a decently high density of locations to explore. Many intriguing places to see, side quests to trigger, and resources to find all add to an exploration that often rewards your curiosity. There are still quite a few things to see in Mexico, but the map's size creates a pressing issue. The density of locations is significantly lower than on Hispaniola, so more often than not, each day will be spent exclusively riding your horse until you run out of movement points, followed by a night camp where everything is auto-selected from the previous day, and the monotony of this cycle becomes quite pressing when you consider that the quests tend to make you ride back and forth between locations that are far apart. Oh, and the camera is still awful here, and I swear to god if I get to hear an opening chest again, I'm gonna pop a vein in my forehead. That being said, it still doesn't feel like you're wasting your time. One contributing factor is the resource management I mentioned earlier. Most of what you do involves gathering or spending resources in various circumstances. After a certain point, the need to constantly hunt for them to break even dials down a bit. But then the game pulls a fast one on you and presents you with another resource sink. You get to reinforce and upgrade the fort built by your Conquistador predecessor, allowing you to tackle the late game when you enter conflict with the Aztecs or the other native tribes. Even if by that stage the campsite of resource management is almost turning a profit, it's still something you need to consider. The role-playing component of the game is definitely no slouch either. In fact, it's the strongest element Conquistador has to offer. This is good news since, it's an RPG. I appreciate the choice of not using voice acting for the dialogue. There is no way a small studio could have afforded to record the amount of text this game offers. Every interaction with an NPC has a lot of flavor, with vivid descriptions and lots of detail to pick up. It's especially great when you deal with characters with more attention paid to them, which is a downside when you notice the contrast between them and the less important characters. It's pretty grating to see all the characters of Hispaniola, the care and attention to flesh them out and make them genuinely interesting, and then go to Mexico and have way less of that. On the first island you have an intriguing array of characters relevant to the rebellion. They're very distinct and exciting to interact with. This plays a big part in making the whole questline enjoyable and engaging until its conclusion. In Mexico, you don't often have that. In many cases you go from one quest dispensing NPC to another, and the odds of both being fleshed out characters is very, very low. There's another issue with Hispaniola. It's wasting your time. You're being launched with the promise of hunting the riches of the new world, only to instantly be thrown into some petty rebellion for a tiny island far away from Spain. It kills the pacing before it even has the chance, and as a consequence it managed to put off a lot of players. I know Steam achievements are not exactly the most reliable thing to discuss, but when the first achievement you can achieve has been collected by 66% of the player base, while the percentage of those completing the Hispaniola questline is only 20%, it's pretty telling. In terms of interesting, the companions have a similar issue to the NPCs. All of them have a backstory and even dialogue associated with them. But those you recruited during the campaign tend to be more detailed than those you pick up during the campaign setup. I don't particularly mind it since after all there's a large selection of characters and implementing elaborate conversations for each takes time, but the contrast is noticeable. Thankfully, the writing is good enough to make you go past this. What I have to mention as a big plus is the game's dedication to the setting while allowing for considerable flexibility on your side. As I mentioned earlier, you're playing as an alternative version of Hernan Cortés, and the game doesn't shy away from giving you choices. You could retrace everything the real-life Conquistador did or do your own thing. For instance, you can ally with the Aztecs instead of supporting a rebellion against them like Hernan Cortés did in reality. This level of player choice applies even to the smallest of quests, with many instances where multiple options are presented to you. Sure, some only impact the morale of your troops according to their personal preferences, but others impact the way quests move forward. In fact, even losing a fight allows you to proceed with the quest in one way or another. I wasn't exaggerating when I said this is primarily an RPG after all. When did I lie to you anyway? Even if the game allows you to rewrite history as you see fit, Conquistador is a really well documented game. Every new place you visit, historical character you meet or ethnic group you encounter comes alongside a lot of reading material with relevant information. You'll be treated nicely if you're into this sort of stuff. It should be mentioned though that the tone of the writing is neutral for the lack of a better term. Since you're able to take any approach you desire and the companions each have different personalities and views, you'll get the opportunity to get in contact with multiple opinions. You can be a peace-loving conquistador that loves the natives and get to hear their racists in the groups complain, or you can take every single native you see and purify them by fire and get sappy speeches from your peaceful companions. You get to see the effects of disease on the native population, the consequences of slavery, the Aztecs' rule impact on the subjugated tribes, and so on. The game never attempts to pass judgment since its sole focus is providing a role-playing experience and describing it as accurately as possible. It's a pretty commendable approach for a role-playing game after all, and considering the delicacy of the subject. Overall, I must say Expeditions Conquistador is a worthwhile game. It's not the deepest RPG, doesn't have the most elaborate turn-based combat system, and its writing doesn't get you tied to the chair in excitement, but it offers a charming experience and does this well in its own way. After all, not all games must be epic and mind-blowing to provide you with a good time. Now I'm curious to get my hands on Vikings and Rome sometime in the future because what's being offered here is promising. Thanks for joining my exploration efforts in these uncharted lands. Press the magical buttons and don't forget to share this video with your like-minded fellows. And until next time, cheers!